Welcome to PC Games Nostalgia, where we talk about yesterday's PC games today. My name is Jimmy Wilhelmsson, and I will be your host for the next 20 minutes or so. The game we're going to probe into today is... Each time we bring a guest from the gaming industry to our digital studio, and today's honored guest star is Anders Gustafsson from Cockroach. You're one of two people at the Cockroach studio, aren't you, Mr. Gustafsson?
Yeah.
May I call you Anders?
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Tell us a little about Cockroach. I know you did a game in several episodes that was called The Dream Machine.
Yeah, it's me and my good friend and colleague Eric. We started working on a game called The Dream Machine.
Okay.
That was a while ago, back in 2008. And we wanted to do something together, and we happen to have a background in animation. I've done television shows for kids and commercials and short films, and Eric has done a lot in stop-motion puppetry.
I interviewed you back then. Is it already 12 years ago? Time flies. And you were doing stop motion with clay figures. Am I right?
Yeah, clay and cardboard is what we use the most. But we've also used popsicle sticks and rocks and mud. We've used old pork chops and condoms. We've used everything.
So one of the great things about Dream Machine is that, like Jim Henson's The Muppets, they actually exist for real. You have them. I mean, in your studio, you have these puppets or whatever you call them.
Yeah, I can show them to you. I have a little cabinet that's right.
Oh, please do. If they're close at hand, please do.
So the clay figures look something like this.
They're big.
Yeah, they are pretty big. This is just a little side. It's easier to build things relatively large. And
I remember we had a long talk back then, 10 or 12 years ago, about the research, or how to say, of John C. Lilly. You were influenced by his, should I call it research, or his writings or his findings in the dream world?
He worked with dolphins a lot, and I think that was his more serious field of research. Okay. And then he had a little hobby theories on the side that he tested privately. And I heard about one of these theories in a biography of him, that he had the idea. He did a lot of drugs. This was the late 60s. He did a lot of drugs with his friends, and he had his own little private theory that the unconscious is shared. That when we dream or when we trip balls, we go to this parallel plane of existence.
We go to the same thing.
We go to the same thing.
Yeah.
So if we were tripping together, we could conceivably meet up and have adventures. And he had that idea or notion, and he wanted to test it. So he did a lot of drugs with his friends. And when they sobered up, they would draw maps and charts and pictures of what they'd seen. So if one of them saw a pyramid, then they would draw that and try to locate it in conjunction with something else. And then the idea was that if they had enough of these map pieces, small map pieces, they could start to splice them together and chart the shared unconscious, which is such a beautiful, naive notion.
Yeah.
That I just fell in love with it right there and then.
Speaking about dreams and other worlds, you're here today and you have chosen to be nostalgic about a little Lucasfilm game called Loom. Tell us, I mean, now it seems obvious, but why did you choose Loom out of all games?
Loom is one of those games I always return to.
Okay.
I mean, it's obviously a great game, but it's also haunting, and it has a lot of story dead ends that are never resolved. And but most of all, I think the world is so well crafted and inviting that when the game ended, I remember I remember feeling that I wanted to live there for several days more after I finished it, and it had the sad, ambiguous ending. Yes, left me feeling gutted that I couldn't stay there and visit the other guilds and have more adventures in that world.
And that's amazing, because those are feelings you normally get from watching movies. Maybe not playing games, because games, worlds, narrative, generally speaking, are not as strong as movies normally for some reason. But so that's kind of weird. Also, from a game that was released in 1990. Yeah. What is Loom? Could you tell us a little? I played it also, but in your words, how can you describe Loom?
Loom takes place in a world that is very mysterious and built up out of several guilds. So you are born into the guild of the weavers who make cloth, and it's the most mysterious guild. Nobody really they keep to themselves, and it's stated throughout the game that people outside that island that they keep themselves to have never met a weaver before. You're the first to venture beyond the boundaries of the Weaver Island.
So, and it's obviously an adventure game, but it's not a normal game, not even for Lucasfilm standard. They were called Lucasfilm back then. They changed to LucasArts somewhere in the 90s. And it's obviously, of course, George Lucas branch of I mean, he did films, and then he started to invest in games. It's not like the regular where you click on for example, Maniac Mansion, where you click on a verb and then you click on the object you want to apply the verb to. In Loom, there are no words at all, more than the spoken words. You can't click on anything. I mean, tell us what the interface is like.
The interface is very, it's almost hidden from you. You don't have that verb section at the bottom of the screen with look at, pick up, etc. You can walk, obviously, and look at things and speak to other people. Those are the verbs you have from the get-go. But then you have to earn the rest of the verbs through playing the game and learning what is called drafts or spells.
Exactly.
Which is an amazing way to do a point-and-click interface.
And they're notes. They have to be
notes.
Somewhat musical.
Yeah, that's right. You can play on 3 different difficulty levels.
Yeah.
And the hardest one demands that you almost have a perfect pitch to discern the different notes.
Because they only play it, and then you're supposed to both remember it and do it on this distaff, it's called. Yeah. It's some kind of part of a loom. I'm not a weaver myself. I've never woven. So I have no idea, but it's the same part that Sleeping Beauty stings herself on, I think, from the fairy tale. I don't know either, but it's some part of a loom that I don't know if you can play notes, but it does in the game. So you have to repeat whatever you hear somewhere. When you see a guy sharpening his knife, you hear some sounds from there, and if you repeat that on your distaff, you know the draft of sharpening or whatever.
Yeah, it's basically a musical instrument. They try to describe it a little bit in the lore of the game. They say that the Guild of Weavers, they are such excellent craftsmen that they can pluck at the strings of existence, and that's what you play.
Right.
You really reach into the fibers of time and space and matter, and that's how they that's how they explain it in the game, which is a very poetic way.
It is. I mean, it's a beautiful game, and I love the game as much as anyone. But for me, I thought the story. I mean, the story, what's happening is okay. It's pretty straightforward. There's a bad guy, chaos and everything, comes forward and just tries to ruin the world, and that's fine. But there is a backstory that I thought was extremely complicated. Beautiful, but complicated. You have the guilds, the weavers, and you had a lot of swans. And the music all over the game is from Tchaikovsky, the Swan Lake. What you, as a professional game developer and a professional animator and used to dealing with manuscripts, what do you think about the story? Is it the story that dragged you into the game, or is it the game itself, you think?
I don't think apart from it's a fairy tale with there's a lot of things I didn't really get, and there's a lot of very abstract notions that the origin story for the main character that you play, Bobbin, he wasn't born like a normal child. He was spun from the Loom. And that's what you hear in the beginning of that audio drama. You hear your mother spin you into existence, and he kind of flops onto the floor.
Yeah. In a hood.
In a hood.
And that was forbidden for some reason, right?
Yeah, she wasn't supposed to do that, and she gets turned into swan, because that's how they punish people in that guild. They turn them into swans.
Yeah, and then the swan flies away into some kind of different world. It was called Transcendence or something.
Yes.
You turn into swan, you can't speak, and then you leave into another world, which is, I don't know, somewhere else.
Yeah, you go into the world beyond, which is Swan Lake, and you have to wait there until the end of time.
Right. And you mentioned an audio drama, and this is fun because if you owned the original game, which you should have, not copy or use a pirate copy or anything, then you got this, an audio cassette tape. Audio cassette tapes are really cool. They look cool. They have cool small little boxes. An audio cassette tape. And on side 1, I can read here, it's the audio drama. This is 30 minutes of the story of how the weavers and the smiths and the whatever guilds, how they fit together. So you're supposed to listen to this. It's like a theater play with people actually talking and then some music.
It did not take long for them to hear of Lady Signa's defiance in the sanctuary and the elders' terrible vengeance.
Then you turn to side B, and it's game music. It's mostly Tchaikovsky with suites from the Swan Lake, but not with the symphony orchestra, but with some kind of Roland synthesizer or something shitty. It doesn't sound that good as I expected, but it's still a cool thing to have. And the producer of this game was Brian Moriarty, and he had some experience before he came to Lucasfilm, I think. He was with the Infocom people.
Yeah, he did. He released 2 games with Infocom that were fantasies as well. Mm-hmm. So when he moved to Lucasfilm, I guess out of habit, he started a new fantasy game.
And out of your, obviously we don't know, it's speculative, but out of your experience, I mean, when you work with, have you ever worked with a text adventure? Infocom, you only worked with text adventures. I mean, there were images, but you had to write and read everything. Every interaction within the world was through text. Have you ever done that?
Yeah, I have, but they ended up really terrible. And I've done similar things where you get alternatives, like in a traditional dialogue tree.
Okay.
That was some of the first games I made. You selected 1, 2, or 3 out of a list of options. I guess that's text based as well, but you didn't have to type in the commands or anything like an Infocom game. Those are pretty hard to make.
I was going to get to that. Yes, I think that's one of the hardest games to do, because not only do you have to tell the player what kind of world you're in through text only, and it cannot be page after page after page. It has to be, somewhat limited.
Yeah.
And then you have to have a parser the parser is the part of the software that interprets your actions. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely.
So you have to have a parser that actually understands a lot of words and also understands when you're failing.
Yeah. The context, they have to understand what you write and the context of when you're writing it. And then it has to feed you hints. In the ideal case, most of them didn't do this, but after a while, if you failed enough, you become bored and you want hints. So it has to be intelligent enough to feed you hints, which is that's quite a programming challenge. And then on top of that, tell an entertaining story, meaningful story that somebody potentially would plunk down money for, and that's a tall ask.
So maybe that's the background he came from. I mean, writing those games. So I guess manuscripts and the whole telling mechanic of a text parser was in his very fiber, and then he came to Lucasfilm and could do this game. I guess that's why it looks like it does. Speaking about failure, you once told me a while ago that correct me if I got this wrong, but one of the most important parts of adventure games is failing. Remember that?
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that? What is it about failing in adventure games that is so important?
When the player fails to solve a puzzle, if you don't give them more information, like a hint or a better understanding, if they don't gain a better understanding for how the puzzle works when they fail, then either they might try the same solution again with a slight variation and still fail. But if they don't get a hint or something like that, then the likely outcome is that they become bored and put the game down, or they go to another room and start cycling the rooms for a tiny detail they missed. So whenever you register, if you make an adventure game and you notice that your playtesters are stuck in those looping behaviors, then that's a clear sign that you should add a hint or clarify the puzzle or cut the puzzle, whatever you can do to help them.
So you actually do that? I mean, back in the day in 1990, you sold a software, they installed it, and you had no connection whatsoever with the player. But you can actually measure where players are stuck and how many and for how long?
Yeah, you can. With an analytics tool, you can measure that pretty exactly. But usually the best information you get just from sitting behind your player with a pen and paper, observing what they do, like a stock. Some of the analytics are for. I used analytics a lot to gauge what item combinations people did, because if you have 20, 30, 40 items in a game, then the combinations that people can do explode. It explodes exponentially. And you can't really write a response for all those item combinations. That would just take your life. And so what I did was to measure what item combinations people did the most. And then I went in and wrote for the top 100. And then if I had time, I would add another 50 or another 100 item combinations after that. So I didn't write for everyone, but I wrote for the ones that people actually did.
So if I say I combine a hammer and a nail, and that's not right, you can give the answer, yeah, but you need a wall also, or something like that.
Yeah,
but if I combine a hammer and a pair of scissors, which makes no sense, it would just say, yeah, I can't do that.
Yeah, or there would be some goofy line or an interpretation of what you perceivably might want to do with a hammer and a...
Wow. Back to Loom. It was released in 1990, like we said before. Could you, if you place yourself back in 1990, where you were, the age you were in and where you lived and what you did, is there anything typical about that year or that time that made Loom evident? I mean, what was Loom a product of something within that time frame, or was it just Brian Moriarty's wacky idea that made it the game to be? Do you understand what I'm aiming at? Was it something around the world back then that made Loom fit in?
I don't know about that, but I know that Lucasfilm were competing a lot with another company called Sierra. They made the King's Quest games and
the Quest games.
The Quest games, and it was the Sierra games always made more money. At least according to Tim Schafer. I read an interview with him where the management of Lucasfilm always came and said, you guys need to make as much money as Sierra. So I think Loom might have been a way to compete with King's Quest games, to do a high fantasy fairy tale-like game.
Right.
In order to compete with,
And I think the odds, it all flipped around once they released The Secret of Monkey Island, of course, which is 1991 or something like that. It's after Loom, at least.
Yeah,
that's probably when the whole Monkey Island UI took over the business.
Yeah, they made a lot of technical progress after Loom, I would say. So Monkey Island and Monkey Island 2 they just had this polish that Sierra lacked.
Right. What if I claim that 1990 was the heyday of the genre, the heyday of adventure games? Not if you were into text adventures, then those were gone. But the heyday of graphical adventures like Sierra and LucasArts, even though LucasArts was early on, they probably released, at least 10 of those a year during those, which of course game companies still do, but in a much larger scale. You had to have them in a box, you have to send them to a shop, and they also cost as much. They had full price. They cost as much as any action game costs, so they were full price. Could that be the reason why they had the guts to invest in such a weird game that Loom was?
Yeah, that and George Lucas had deep pockets, of course. They had money to burn. Yeah, he still does. But yeah, they had only two. When you got hired, they only told you two things: don't lose money and don't embarrass George. And the rest was more or less up to you, which is a very cool way to hire people.
Right.
But I guess and with the pedigree of Brian Moriarty and fantasy games, that it was an easy game to greenlight, I guess. But I think you're right about the heyday of adventure games. If you look at a magazine, computer games magazine from 1990, I guess 75% of the games in there, maybe less, but would be adventure game titles. And that's the genre that made the most money back then as well. That was the first-person shooter of the early 90s. The story, though, has a lot of death and punishment in it, even caused by Bobbin himself. At one point, this is a spoiler for a game that came out
it's fine
30 years ago. At one point, a dragon is chasing you.
Yeah.
And in order to get away from that dragon, you have to cast a spell called Reflect on a little boy. And that way, that little boy looks like your reflection. And then the dragon comes after him instead. And there's a horrible sequence when that little boy he basically gets half his body eaten by the dragon. And that's caused by you.
Yeah.
And later on, his ghost confronts you with what you've done. Why did you do that? Why you didn't even warn me that you had a dragon after you? Didn't I have the right to live my life as, like any other boy? And I felt so guilty about that when at that point in the game. I felt horrible being confronted by the ghost of a dead boy that I'd not even inadvertently killed. I indirectly killed him, but certainly caused his death.
Anders, thank you so much. It's been
Yes,
great
thank
talking to
you.
you. It's always great talking to you about adventure games because it's a genre I love and it's a genre I know so little about, but that I want to know more about. I've told you dozens of times I would love to develop a adventure game somewhere, but I don't have the time and I don't have the knowledge, so it's not going to happen. But it's great talking to you, someone who really has and knows a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great talking to you as well. It's a weird old mysterious genre that never really goes away. Truly, it's always there in some capacity, and it changes slightly. I consider Portal and Disco Elysium to be point-and-click adventure games, but that's then you have to stretch the definition of it slightly.
Right. Okay, so thank you very much. Good luck with your newly released game, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Yeah, talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye.